it's not a problem. Hopefully some of you can watch this a little bit later on. Well, I seem really close to the camera on this occasion. Anyway, what we're going to look into in this episode is this particular chapter. It's actually chapter 20 from Martin Bailey's book, Van Gogh's Finale, and it's a chapter titled Father and Son. We're not going to go through a heck of a lot of the chapter. We'll probably split it into two parts, and then that'll likely conclude this series. I really did want to do this as a shared commentary with Stephanie, but Stephanie's having a very busy month, and I'm probably not going to be around next weekend, so I just sort of wanted to get this done not too far after, so it's still fresh in your minds, after the previous episodes dealing with the funeral and so on. I see Hey Jealousy is in. Good to see you here. Quite a few of you have voted already, or some of you voted already. 90% of the votes are that Van Gogh was shot in the wheat fields, right? So I'm going to be addressing that question. It's actually a critical question because where Van Gogh was shot is also going to give an indication of the likelihood that it was someone else or him, right? So in the previous couple of episodes, a lot of you have been following it, seem to be convinced that it's not suicide. Of course, if it is suicide, then it's likelier that it's suicide if he was sort of alone, right? If he was somewhere in the countryside, if he was somewhere, do you know what I mean? You know, if somebody commits suicide, they tend to do it in private. They tend to do it in a controlled space or in a space where people aren't around, right? So just in a general sense, I think one could say that it is more likely that he committed suicide if it was like somewhere out in the country, like the wheat fields, and less likely that he committed suicide if it was not in the wheat fields and it was sort of just in the town, right? By the same token, I think you could argue if he was shot in the town of Orvez, the likelihood then increases that it was murder, right? So what I'm going to do in this episode is we're going to look at a map. I'm also going to show you a very clear map showing where Van Gogh lived, where the shooting apparently took place, and certain other things. And then it's going to kind of become quite explicit what you're talking about. Now, I've sort of said all along, I think it's murder. I think the murderer was Dr. Gachet. And you might say, well, what evidence do you have to support that? And that is the problem. You know, we don't have the gun. We don't have too many witnesses. There are witnesses. We don't have too many. But one of the things that is a real sort of pillar of true crime is if you have a hypothesis, if you have a theory, and it tends to be grounded in reality, you tend to find more and more reinforcement for it, right? I don't mean you imagine that you're finding it. I mean you literally do find more and more reinforcement for it. And you've got to be still careful that you're not being infected by cognitive bias, that you're not seeing what you want to see. But this is quite a good example of, so does this identification of the location does that settle the matter? Does that prove your case, or does that help you prove your case? What do you think the answer is to that? Then, okay, Timmy, do you want to just My rib is definitely a bit more tender today than it's been. I saw Amy. Amy's here as well. Good to see you, Amy. So we're gonna go into that sort of area. By the same token, if you have a theory and it's not accurate, then you will tend to find that it dissolves. It's sort of, there's less and less supporting evidence, and it's not really going anywhere. You're not going to find more to support it. Gathering Place, good to see you here. Thanks for your your comment earlier on YouTube. So quite a good way to illustrate what I'm talking about, we're going to go to the book in a few moments, is in the John Benet Ramsey case and the Madeleine McCann case. There are these sort of competing narratives, and they're quite similar in both of them. The one competing narrative is that a family member or someone closely related to or close to the child victim was involved, right? That's the one scenario. The other scenario is that it was a stranger and an intruder. And so you can make your case for the one side of the case, and you can make your case for the other. Now, the interesting thing with both the Madeleine McCann case and the John Benet Ramsey case is you sort of have this idea that there's evidence supporting a stranger, an intruder, and then it gets to a certain point, and then they say, oh, no, it wasn't that guy. Then they jump to the next one. And they say, yeah, it looks like this is a really good candidate for, and then it jumps to the next guy and the next guy and the next guy. And you can go through the archive, how many suspects there have been for this particular candidate in the John Benet Ramsey case. And you can go through the archive of how many different suspects there have been in the Madeleine McCann case. And what you're seeing there is not what you want to see. What I mean is, if you're trying to solve a case and you've got a theory, you're going to go, the evidence is going to sort of be really strong, reinforcing, integrated, but sort of going to a particular end result, right? Put another way, it's going to keep reinforcing a particular suspect and the possibility of their involvement. Now, with the Madeleine McCann case and John Benet Ramsey case, it sort of just jumps. Is it this person? Could it be that one? Could it be that one? And it's very superficial. It's very light. It's very almost random. Maybe it's this person. Maybe it's that one. And then, but what that pretends to be is reinforcing this idea that person was involved. It pretends to be, this is a breakthrough, this is more information, when it's actually the opposite. It becomes, it could be this person, we know more about that, and that, and that, and then it's not that person, and then it goes to somebody else, right? And that's a very important thing to have in your mind whenever you're dealing with a true crime case, is whatever your theory is, and I'm talking about as a legitimate investigator, as a serious researcher, is this hypothesis, is this theory of who the suspect is it being borne out more and more by the circumstances, by the evidence, by their psychology, by, to some extent, the victimology, all that? Does that make sense? In other words, everything needs to fit together more and more and more, not less and less and less. And so in the same way, in the Vincent van Gogh case, you say, oh, so you have this theory that it might be Dr. Gachet. And so we're now going to deal with Dr. Gachet and his son in this chapter of Bailey's book. And then we're going to look at the location of the shooting. And the question then is, does it look like we are moving closer to the resolution, to the solving, to the, to the validation to some extent of this theory that you've got, or are we seeing it being increasingly invalidated? It's as simple as that. As we get more information, is it taking you closer to your theory, or is it taking you away? And most reasonable people can say one way or the other what the answer is to that. And that's also why you've got to kind of keep an open mind to some extent. You've got to keep an open mind that the thing that you're trying to prove, some evidence may not necessarily, you may think some evidence definitively proves that, but there may be another reason for it, if that makes sense. Faticus is in the house. Good to see you. Yvonne Phillips, good to see you here. Faticus says, I got some downtime at work, thought I would drop in. Good to see you here. Scratching Timmy's ears. Timmy's now really comfy. He's in his sort of straddle position. The cat is sort of wandering around. He's just opened the cupboard door to have a wander in there. I think before I get started, I'm just going to give a few more of you a chance to get in there. There are only 17 of you are in chat right now. Maybe a few more will join. Let me tell you a little bit about my rib injury. Gathering Place actually asked me about it, and the truth is I made quite a lot of progress until today, and unfortunately I was trying to, there's an area in front of my front door where I'm trying to kind of create a forest in my garden, and there's an area above my front door where there's so much leaves and creepers and vines that it's almost like you've got to brush it aside just to get into the front door. So I've been successful in creating this forest, but in a way too successful. So I kind of just got some plastic wire ties, it's sort of quite I think some of the biggest wire ties you get. And I was just trying to sort of bind the branches and bind them together so that it's not sort of hanging over the doorway. And so I was using one hand, I was using my left arm, the arm where the broken rib is, to sort of hold the vine up. It's not very heavy, but it's quite difficult to hold that up while you're trying to twist this plastic tie around it and then secure it. And, I did one, and it was a bit uncomfortable, but it wasn't a big deal. And then I did, I think, a second one, and it was either between the first and the second or the second and the third. I just really hurt my rib. I don't know, it's straight. I stretched it or something, but I just felt a painful stabbing sort of pain, and that wasn't the end of it. When I, like if I was just walking, I felt this horrible needle-like pain. Just now with the slightest movement. So whatever I did, I must have damaged the sort of area where the healing had taken place. And I really feel crap about it because I've sort of set back that period of recovery by some space. It's not like the end of the world. I mean, I'm not feeling in any pain now, and I slept without pain. Funny enough, when this happened, the painkillers my doctor prescribed they just finished. So it's quite weird how that worked out. But so that's just some background in terms of that. Something else that was just quite interesting today was I was having lunch somewhere, and I called up a friend of mine who's in Bali. And we haven't spoken for a while, and I actually thought I was going to join him in Bali, maybe just do a short trip out there. But he said he'd seen all he'd wanted to see. I thought he was going to stay there for a few months, but he said he's heading back to Australia, and he said he's actually been watching this show, the Van Gogh series, and he said, you know, I'm actually not interested in Van Gogh at all, but it's your interest, your enthusiasm that made me sort of watch it and kind of be interested. And I asked him, you know, have I convinced you? And he said, yeah. So that was quite gratifying. So anyway, Garth, if you're watching, hope you are doing well and good luck with your trip back to Australia. So I think we had 15 minutes. We've got a few more people in chat. Maybe we should get going. Fatika says, takes time to heal. You're the type that has a tough time doing nothing. Yeah, that is true. Fatika says, rib fractures are the most painful. You literally have to keep still in the upper torso area. Well, you might think, you know, like, given the fact that I can hold my dog in this arm and other things, I just got a message from Garth. Good to see you. Good to have you here. You wouldn't think that the rib was completely broken, given the fact that I can sleep on my side, that I'm in virtually no pain about 2 weeks later. You wouldn't think that it's like a totally broken rib. The area where it's broken seems to be on that side, so on the back part of my body. Although when I did this maneuver at the front door earlier today, it felt like I was sort of in pain right around. So from the chest side to the side of my body to the back. So that it felt like the whole rib had sort of dislodged. So, I mean, I have been in excruciating pain. Getting in and out of a vehicle has been absolutely agonizing, but I can now do it without any pain, with minimal discomfort. So, you know, it's not like 6 weeks of agony. I don't know whether some people do go through that, but my period of very horrible pain was relatively short, like probably about 5 or 6 days. Although, having said that, it felt like it was quite a long time. So anyway, that's my story. Fatikas, thanks a lot for that. Thanks for that. Cool. Yvonne says, your I didn't tell you everything narrative was quite the story. My basic thought was that you were blindsided by a type of psychological warfare. I'm glad you were able to reset yourself. Thanks. Yeah, I'm kind of still resetting myself. I sort of feel a bit shaken in a lot of ways. I sort of feel like because there's not like a big case right now, even my YouTube coverage feels a bit fragmented, feels a bit broken. In a way, I don't really mind, because I want to sort of lose the momentum a bit to get all that energy back in a way. So I'm sort of going through a period of healing, rest, recuperation, refocusing, recovering, all that kind of thing. Okay, so I think I'm going to get started here. Hey Jealousy says, my buddy was incredulous when I told him Van Gogh was our current case. Oh, okay, that's interesting. Okay, Timmy, I'm going to have to let you down, or you're going to have to jump off so I can look at this book. So we are going to chapter 20 of Martin Bailey's book, and it's page 161. Stephanie's not here, but I presume you are going to be following in your book. I'm not going to go through it line by line. I'm not going to read through very much here, but what I am going to do is just touch on what I've highlighted here. So halfway through the page, I've highlighted the following, which where Bailey writes, right from the start, Dr. Gachet assumed responsibility for the care of Vincent's grave. So this is already quite bizarre, is if you, again, link the narrative to itself. So you say, what kind of dude was Dr. Gachet prior to all of this happening? And we know that he didn't seem to, he didn't spend much time at the gallery when he visited Theo. He didn't really seem to offer much health advice when Vincent asked for help in the treatment of his family. You know, his brother was sick, his sister-in-law was sick, his nephew was sick as well, and Dr. Gachet just said, well, give them some beer or something like that. He didn't seem particularly attentive. And then, of course, when Van Gogh was in the situation he was in, where he'd been shot, the doctor was like, according to certain witnesses anyway, he seemed very inattentive, cold, even callous. Thanks a lot for that, hey, jealousy. And so you have this sort of idea of him as being not particularly involved. And then as soon as Van Gogh has died, then he sits down and he sketches him and he ends up painting him 3 times. And then he also starts going, sort of becoming really involved in taking care of his grave. Now, if on the one hand you could say, well, he really was a good guy, he was a good friend. On the other hand, you could say, if he did shoot Van Gogh, then you may have 2 things going on here. On the one hand, you may have the feelings of guilt. So he's doing this out of guilt. On the other hand, you could say he's kind of protecting the evidence. He's kind of protecting the, you could say, if the bullet was still in the body, he's making sure that that's not going to somehow fall into someone else's hands. But it is an interesting thing that Dr. Gachet, not Theo, not his wife, not the innkeeper, not Anton Herschig, Dr. Gachet assumes responsibility for the care of Vincent's grave. Now, Dr. Gachet didn't even assume responsibility for his patient when he was dying. You know, he didn't try and take the bullet out. We don't even know if he performed an autopsy, but now suddenly he's playing the role of not grave digger, but grave custodian, right? And he's a doctor, right? So, and another thing to bear in mind is when Dr. Gachet himself died, he thought he was too good for Orvez. He wanted to be buried in a cemetery in Paris where a lot of famous people are buried. So you've kind of got this weird disconnect where Dr. Gachet wants to be involved in this sort of, what's the word, anonymous, small-time cemetery, but when he dies, no, I need the big time, I need a big elaborate grave, etc. The other thing that is mentioned here is it says he and his son maintained the grave right up until the 1950s. Pretty incredible, hey? So it's not just that he went to the grave and he made sure everything was in order and he sort of, had his gardener or someone plant some sunflowers there and set up the headstone and sorted everything out. He maintained it for decades. That's quite interesting, isn't it? Him and his son maintained the plot of the grave right up until the 1950s, which is when Van Gogh became really famous, right? Then at the bottom of page 161, it says, and this I really didn't know. So Van Gogh was buried in a certain kind of plot, and they planted sunflowers around it, and they, father and Dr. Gachet and his son sort of maintained this little area. And then it says here at the bottom of page 161 that in 1905, so 15 years after Van Gogh's death, it says the deadline for the lease approached. And I think what that means is the area in terms of where the grave was, that land was actually leased land, and now the deadline was approaching, and so you either were going to renew the the lease or something else, right? And so Dr. Gachet wrote to Joe. By this stage, Theo had already died, and Vincent's brother, and he died of syphilis. And Dr. Gachet basically said to Joe, I think we need to get a permanent grave. We need to get a proper permanent sort of site, right? Fadika says, is there Vincent van Gogh actual cemetery plot you can visit? It's a good question. One of the things Garth said to me was, what makes your commentary interesting and brings it to life is the fact that you were there. And I was there. I did go and visit Van Gogh's grave. I actually went to it several times. I did wander around the wheat fields, which are immediately behind it, and obviously noticed that the size of the grave, the orientation of the graves in terms of, it's like it's not in a corner of the courtyard. If you just look above the graves, you see the wheat fields behind them. Also, there's a gravestone for Vincent and then Theo. And the other thing that's really interesting is when Theo died 6 months later, he didn't die in Paris. He didn't die even in France. As far as I understand, Theo went to an asylum, I think, in the Netherlands, and kind of went nuts when he was there. And it was quite a horrible end. I mean, he had syphilis as well, but he kind of got very unhinged and wanted to murder his wife and child, and went crazy and then died, right? And that just shows you to what extent syphilis can, you might say it was something else that caused this behavior. But I think it is interesting that this idea that syphilis can actually start to make you act in crazy ways, which is what I believe happened. But the bottom line is that Theo, when he died, wasn't even in France. He was in the Netherlands. And so the decision was made to transport his body all the way back to France, to Paris, and from there to Orvez, so that they could put his body beside his brother's, which I think was quite a kind, authentic, and sort of generous gesture. Just quite an important thing, I think, that happened. So yeah, if you go to Orvez, there is a cemetery there, and you will find Van Gogh's grave there with Theo beside it. When I was there, there were sunflowers on it, but I think they were fake. They were I think, plastic sunflowers. And as I understand it, the ivy growing on the grave, on both graves, actually came from Dr. Gachet's garden. So you kind of have the graves covered over with a kind of creeper, and you could argue that is that a kind of a way of protecting the grave, that no one opens it up, or if someone does, you would know, kind of thing, or it would just make it harder. I mean, the fact is, all the other graves in that cemetery, it's a fairly small cemetery, maybe 50 meters across by maybe 25 meters. It was bigger than I thought, but still relatively small, and it's kind of in the country. It's on the other side of Orvez, the other side of the ridge. As I say, when you look over the wheat fields, when you look over the wall of the grave, so you have the graves, and then there's a wall immediately behind the graves. If you look above that wall, there are the wheat fields. I actually think I took a video of it, but a lot of the video I took during my trip to Europe, I'm not sure. I think I downloaded it somewhere, and some of it I put on Instagram, but some of it I seem to have lost until I find it. So anyway, so it says here, in 1905, the deadline for the end of the lease, approached, and Dr. Gachet wrote to Joe, and he said, we need to get a permanent grave. And then it was during this situation, so this was in 1905, this was 15 years after Vincent's death, also about 15 years after Theo's death, the idea came up that they should maybe get a double space, and they could then move Theo's remains from Utrecht. So Theo had actually been buried for 15 years in the Netherlands. It wasn't like he died and they just moved him to the cemetery where Vincent was buried. He had been dead and buried for 15 years. And then they exhumed his remains and then transported them to France and then to Orvez, right? So that Theo's remains could lie beside his brothers. And once again, the idea to do this actually comes from Dr. Gachet. This idea of let's exhume the one brother, let's exhume the other brother, and let's bury them next to each other, and I'm going to help arrange all of that, right? Faticus asked, what was Theo's age at death? It was, I think, 34. Vincent was 37. And so you had this interesting situation where Theo's wife didn't really like this idea. And you can kind of understand that, you know, Theo's wife didn't like the idea of disturbing the grave of her husband. I don't really know whether she was back in the Netherlands, but I presume she was. So it's almost like, I don't know, if she was in the Netherlands and his grave is in the Netherlands, like, you know, if I want to visit him, is nearby. And in any event, Dr. Gachet seemed to convince her to move Theo's remains all the way to France so that it could be beside Vincent's remains. So Bailey writes, Joe disliked the idea of disturbing, and so it's not only that, it's also that Vincent's remains had to be exhumed as well, because he was actually moved. Where he's buried right now isn't where he was always buried. So you actually had both brothers exhumed, and Joe didn't really like that idea, and you can kind of understand it. So Joe writes, she disliked the idea of disturbing Vincent's bones, but if it meant that they could be accompanied by those of her husband, well, then that was sort of okay. So she didn't really like the idea, but by then, remember, Joe wrote a book based on the letters of her husband to her brother-in-law, Vincent van Gogh, and so she was keenly aware of their close relationship, their close bond, and they are both brothers that have both died. And so she was a sensitive woman, wise enough to say, wise enough and sort of good enough to sort of say, I think this is actually what is needed, as kind of grotesque as it was. You know, you're actually going to be, you know, unearthing both of these individuals in order to put them next to one another. And I don't know, I can imagine a lot of people actually saying no to that idea. I can imagine a lot of people saying no to that idea, but where we are today, it feels like a good result, doesn't it? And so Joe had to authorize Dr. Gachet to proceed. Joe had to give Dr. Gachet permission. So what are we actually talking about here? We're talking about Dr. Gachet's in France, in Orvez, and he's asking the sort of nearest relative, is it okay if I dig up Vincent's bones? I mean, he's also making the offer about Theo, but he's basically saying, do you mind if I exhume Vincent's body? And he's giving his reasons, but nevertheless, he's the one who's doing it. And he's the one who, as I say, I feel is implicated in this, right? And so Joe writes, she disliked the idea of disturbing Vincent's bones, but if it meant that they could be accompanied by those of her husband, well, then that was sort of okay. So you actually had both brothers exhumed, and Fatika says, okay. Fatika says, no need to say my name. Okay. Hey, Jealousy says, rest in places. Good to see you here, Paddy. Theo at the time of death here was 34. So now we go into page 162. And here you've got quite an interesting, I don't want to lose this bookmark, but I guess it's not really necessary. So here you have a picture of Dr. Gachet, and there he's got his hand on the skull, right? And over there is a drawing he did, I think, of the grave. And there's another drawing of the grave as it is today, right? Now, if you look at this picture of Dr. Gachet, he's wearing that same sort of cap, and he's got his hand on the skull, and then now he's writing something, right? And you can kind of see Dr. Gachet's got this weird ghoulish attitude to death. It seems like he's more interested in death than in life. I just want to, so this particular painting, portrait of Dr. Gachet, was a watercolor painted by Dr. Gachet's son. So Dr. Gachet's son paints Dr. Gachet with this hand on the skull, and he signs it Louis van Rysel, which is a pseudonym for Paul Gachet Jr. And if you just think about it, the name of the painting is Portrait of Dr. Gachet, and ultimately a portrait of Dr. Gachet became the most expensive Vincent van Gogh painting ever. And we know there was supposedly a portrait of Dr. Gachet that Dr. Gachet himself owned, which a lot of people believe is fake. So yeah, you've got his own son also painting a portrait of Dr. Gachet, and yeah, he's got his hand on a skull, and he's writing something down, and there's another figure there as well, and he's also got the cap on and so on. It's just weird, isn't it? It's just really quite bizarre, the whole thing. Yvonne says Gachet was kind of macabre. Yeah, so he did have skulls in his home, and his home sort of backed out into sort of an ancient cemetery. So every now and then after it rained, you'd have bones sort of rolling into the garden, or sort of you'd, stub your toe or kick your foot on a rock, and it would turn out to be a human bone of some sort, right? And so you kind of got the idea that this guy was very familiar. Very familiar with death. I mean, he was in the military. He performed autopsies. His home was sort of backed into a graveyard. He had skulls in his home, and here he is sort of hanging out in graveyards, and he can't wait to exhume Vincent's bones, and he just wants to, that's sort of what's going on. He's quite a good grave dude. He's quite a good he's quite active in that area, but in terms of as a doctor, what did he actually achieve? It's just quite an interesting thing to look at. So what I've written here is he wouldn't operate to remove the bullet, but he's happy to exhume his corpse. Just think about that. So it's like this doctor is confronted with the issue of this guy who's been shot. He's a military doctor. It's a bullet wound. It's not like some, it's a wound that he would have had some experience with, you would think, as a military doctor. And he decides, I'm not going to do anything. We're not going to remove the bullet. as far as I know, Vincent asked him to remove the bullet, and he said, "I want to save you, and I want to help you," but that's not what other people observed. Anyway, he won't operate to remove the bullet, but he's happy to exhume his corpse. He's also happy to draw all these pictures of him afterwards. So anyway, Joe then traveled to Orvez on the 9th of June, 1905. It was her first trip back there for 15 years. She'd apparently visited the cemetery where Vincent had died, subsequently with Theo, while Theo was still alive, in late August or September 1890. And Theo then died himself October, November, December, about 4 months later. So 4 months after visiting the grave of his brother with his wife, Theo himself was in a cemetery. And now you had the situation where Joe now returns to Orvez, and she actually observes the exhumation, right? She actually, and I didn't really know this. I didn't know about this until I read Martin Bailey's book. And so Joe Van Gogh is there, Theo's wife, now widow, and she watches how Vincent van Gogh's grave is being removed from the ground, and Dr. Gachet and his son and the grave digger are also present. So it's not like Joe goes there and sort of supervises it. Dr. Gachet's there, and his son's also there. So it's almost like you can almost imagine Dr. Gachet, who's a doctor, took off work so that he could personally be present when this grave came out the ground. And so Bailey describes them watching Vincent's rotted coffin being brought out of the ground, and his son, so Dr. Gachet Jr., not Dr. Paul Gachet Jr., described how the thuja, which I think is some kind of plant, had spread its roots around his torso. So in other words, there was some plant above the grave that had, by this time, so 15 years had gone by, its roots had actually gone into Vincent's chest, I guess, the bones of his chest, and it says penetrating the cavities between the ribs. So yeah, you've got, I mean, it's quite a graphic description, and kind of quite gross. You've got Dr. Gachet's son describing a plant that is problematic during this exhumation, that has now literally got its sort of fingers into the ribs of Van Gogh, which is, you know, if you want to look at what was the ballistics, what was the trajectory of this bullet, where is the bullet? You've got this plant that is now interfering with all of that. Yvonne says, was Joe's and Theo's child there too? It doesn't appear to be so. I can kind of understand that. He would have been about 16 years old at that point, which is quite young to be seeing something like that. And as you can see, and as you can gather, this is quite a gross, uncomfortable, disturbing thing that's happening. It's not like you're just taking the coffin out the ground. You've literally got to take a part of a plant apart that has, you know, gotten into this. So there's another figure here painted by Blanche de Rossi, Van Gogh's first grave, and then it just shows these the plants that are obviously around it, right? And you kind of get the idea that those plants, seems like a heck of a lot of plants as well, that those plants were planted by Dr. Gachet. I mean, if he was maintaining the grave, surely he planted those plants. They didn't just come up by themselves. And we also know he had a garden and so on. And so that's also quite interesting. It's like this idea of, did he plant those plants to sort of obscure the grave? Was he doing it to beautify it? What is the sort of motive of planting all these things around the grave, right? And one can equally ask, was there some sort of motive in exhuming Van Gogh's body? You know, could he not just have paid the lease? Could he not just have paid, okay, we're going to pay for the next 50 years, whatever it was? Could he not have done that? The other thing to bear in mind is that Dr. Gachet was part of he sort of had the credentials to perform autopsies. He was sort of part of a society of doctors that did autopsies. And there's speculation about whether he did the autopsy or if he didn't, but if he didn't, maybe it was bothering him that there was a bullet in this body, and if this artist became famous, wouldn't someone eventually ask the question, what happened to the bullet? Where did the bullet come from? And, you know, who above all would be thinking about that than someone who does autopsies for a living? That makes sense. Not for a living, but who performs autopsies. Who would be thinking about post-mortem things in such a deep way, right? Yvonne says, oh, wow, this is creeping me out. It is creepy. So on page 163, it says the gravedigger had to disentangle the roots from around the rib cage. It kind of also makes you think whatever coffin they used wasn't particularly sturdy. And I think what was mentioned in the funeral thing was that literally fluid was coming through the coffin. And there was some speculation that the reason that occurred was because there had been an autopsy and there were additional incisions. I know it is quite gross. And so page 163 is really, really eye-opening, maybe not in a good way, but I actually learned something here. So a lot of what, let's say, 80 to 90% of what I read in Martin Bailey's book, I already knew, and I knew things beyond that. But there were quite a few little details and quite big details that I didn't know. And there were a couple of things he said that I simply thought it's a particular interpretation that I don't think is true. For example, that Van Gogh went out that evening. It doesn't really matter if he did or if he didn't, but a lot of people say he went out to paint that day, and when he came back, he was bleeding and he left his painting supplies. But my understanding is that he didn't return and then go out again because Adeline Reboux would have said so. She would have said he came for dinner or whatever it was. Meanwhile, they were waiting for him, and it was like, why are you late? Where have you been? In any event, this part on page 163 definitely expanded my knowledge, and I wrote here in the book, very interesting exclamation mark. So I'm just going to quote it, just like one paragraph from Martin Bailey's book. It says, quote, the cranium was then exposed. So they've now removed the skeleton, I guess, from the ground, from the grave. They've taken the roots out of the rib cage, and now at this point, the cranium was then exposed, right? Giving Dr. Gachet the chance to observe the huge skull, the cheekbones, and the arch of the eyebrows. His son commented that unknowingly we reenacted the scene of the gravediggers from Hamlet. The doctor then handed the skull to Gachet Jr. So yeah, you literally have Dr. Gachet taking Vincent's skull in his hand. And this is possibly why he did this sketch. And then he hands what used to be the head of Van Gogh, the skull, he hands it to his son, who gently placed it at the end of the new coffin. For Joe's sake, the exhumation needed to be completed swiftly, although Dr. Gachet wanted to study the ensemble and particularly the skull. So you kind of have the situation where Dr. Gachet asks for permission to do this. Joe actually comes there to kind of supervise it, and you kind of have this weird tension where Joe, for her benefit, based on her feelings, it needs to be completed quickly, and you would think in a way professionally, you just really want to transfer these remains from A to B, and of course the doctor has a sort of a different feeling. He wants to examine the remains, and in the words here, study the ensemble. I mean, what kind of description is that? Study the ensemble, almost like it's a cast of characters or something. I don't know. It's like to use the word ensemble for human bones just seems to me pretty out of touch with what's going on. Anyway, there's a footnote here. I just want to see who wrote this. He also says that he particularly wanted to study the skull. I just want to see who wrote this. It's footnote 8. Footnote 8 from chapter 20. I'm not surprised. That was written by Gachet Jr., Paul Gachet Jr., I think in 1953. It also says here, Joe later remembered clearly the shape of the skull. And so you kind of have this father and son doing this thing that they want to do. Joe sort of standing by. You can almost imagine that she's got her arms crossed, and the doctor and son are really excited about what's going on, and Joe's sort of quite disturbed. She's lost her husband, and it's quite a grisly, gruesome thing that she's got to observe. And then Paul Gachet seemed to really find the whole thing terribly interesting, so much so that he was painting paintings about it, and he would go on to write, I think, a book about it, and just got more and more caught up in it. And of course, part of this was what led to Van Gogh becoming famous, this macabre interest in what was going on, the fact that they had his paintings, the fact that his father wanted to become a well-known painter. And so indirectly, he sort of did. Dr. Gachet never became really a well-known painter in terms of his own work, but he did become well-known through Van Gogh becoming famous as the painter who painted the portrait of Dr. Gachet. That makes sense. But you also sort of wonder, was Dr. Gachet trying to find a way to fame through another artist? And was he doing it in a respectable way, would you say? So just to go back to the poll, there are now 34 votes. There are 41 of you watching, so I hope you guys can also vote. Where did the Van Gogh shooting take place? It's now come down to 62% of you are saying in the wheat fields, and up to 38% are saying in the town of Auvers. So we're getting a bit closer to 50-50. I am going to address the location a little bit later on. I'm just going to do maybe another page or two. So here is the part that is really, really interesting. And the question that I've been asking all along, this is kind of a central question. And I think I did mention this in my book, but without knowing this. And the question was, wouldn't there be a way to investigate what happened to Van Gogh by like x-raying his grave? And you would go to where he's buried right now, assuming he'd always been buried there. And you would assume, okay, well, if you x-ray it, what are you going to see? And then that is going to be how you help, figure it out. Meanwhile, there's all of this intrigue. here that he was actually buried somewhere else previously. Dr. Gachet exhumed the body and was involved in, removing the bones and placing the bones somewhere else. And so Bailey writes here, and what about the bullet? Right? He writes, and what about the bullet? And that is what you want to know. What about the bullet? And so Bailey speculates, he writes, it may well have been removed from Vincent's body before the funeral, but if it had remained in his chest, then it would very likely have become dislodged when the thuja root was untangled from the ribs. And I've highlighted this in this context. I've highlighted the following. Gachet Jr. does not mention the bullet in his explicit description of the exhumation, which I find very, very interesting. It's like, I'm going to go to all this detail. I'm going to talk about the shape of the skull, and we reenacted the scene of the gravediggers and everything, and blah, 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 blah. Oh, but the thing that's actually the most important, we're not really interested in that. We are exhuming this body not because we want to recover the bullet or get rid of the bullet or cover anything up. We not even interested in the bullet, and he doesn't even mention it. And I've always said in true crime, the absence of evidence is also evidence. The absence of the thing that you are most looking for, the commentary, the thought, the statement that is the most seminal, where that is absent, that can be a problem. So even Bailey is kind of like, okay, I've gone through all of this research, and these guys have been quite explicit about drawing pictures and writing really detailed descriptions. I mean, he writes here, Gachet Jr. does not mention the bullet in his explicit description of the exhumation. And he goes on to say that this suggests, Bailey writes this, he says, it suggests, but it does not prove that the projectile may indeed have been extracted before the 1890 burial. And so it's really interesting conjecture here. It is, was the bullet already removed or not, or was it not removed and it was now actually recovered, but nobody said anything about it, and instead we're distracted by these roots that are apparently in the rib cage. We're going to, instead of talk about the bullet, we're going to talk about a plant and its roots and think about that. The other thing that I think is interesting is you've got to kind of ask, what was the motive for this exhumation? So on the one hand, you could say, was it altruistic? Was the doctor actually a good guy? Was he sort of looking out for his former friend? Or was he thinking, like, the number one reason I want to dig up this body is I've got to get hold of this bullet, and I've got to destroy it or get rid of it or hide it away, or I've got to separate this bullet from Van Gogh. Otherwise, I'm going to be in trouble, right? So either his motive is that, in other words, I'm doing this because of the bullet, or it's something else. And so the fact that the bullet isn't even mentioned, so there's this mystery around the bullet, and the mystery is, was the bullet removed during an autopsy that nobody mentioned, or was the bullet removed during the exhumation, but nobody mentioned that it was removed then either. And it's kind of a difficult one, because on the one hand, I guess one could say that there's some evidence to prove there was an autopsy. Maybe he couldn't find the bullet. Like maybe he performed the autopsy and couldn't find the bullet. Maybe the bullet was really very deep in the tissues, and he was sort of pressed for time and he just simply couldn't find it. Right, that's the one possibility. The other possibility is the bullet, that there wasn't an autopsy, but certainly you would imagine after 15 years, the bullet's going to be quite easy to find because there is going to be no flesh remaining, no, everything's going to be reduced to dust and bone, and the bullet will now reveal itself, if that makes sense. Fadiga says, going back to work, I'm definitely going to check out tomorrow's playback. What an awesome tale. Nick is a natural storyteller. Thanks a lot. Yvonne says, bye. Paddy says, the elephant in the graveyard. Absolutely. Yvonne says, still hiding the crime. Hey Jealousy says, that's how they found the orphanage bodies in Canada. So even Bailey's like, this is a little bit weird, he's so explicit about this, what happened to the bullet, and why is no one actually talking about it? Even Bailey's sort of aware of that. There's even talk about, like, you might say, okay, we don't know about the bullet. Well, we even know about what happened to the thuja plant, that they uprooted it, and then the bush was actually brought back to the Gachet residence. And so what's quite interesting with the thuja is it grew in the Gachet garden. The thuja plant was taken to Vincent's grave, planted sort of over it, did its thing. After it was exhumed, they took it back to the residence. You kind of get this weird sense of there's this incredible detail in certain things, and then in other areas, no detail, right? Then they say this thuja plant was replanted near the front door, and today it's grown into a large tree and continues to thrive. So I guess if you go to, I'm not quite sure what the thuja plant is, and I probably saw it without seeing it. But I mean, when you do see it, you kind of got to think, wow, this plant went on a little journey. It went somewhere, and it sort of put its feet into Vincent van Gogh's chest and bones, and then got brought back to where it originally lived and lived happily ever after. It's quite a weird story, that in itself. And so it goes on. So now that they've moved Van Gogh's remains, now Dr. Gachet wants to have a bronze medallion made, and he wants to add this to the, I guess, the gravestone, and he's sort of part of that. He's going to design that, I guess. So once again, you've got this incredible involvement in the sort of post-mortem activities. We're gonna do this, we're gonna do that, and then you just say, but when he was actually dying, why did you do nothing? Why was it like, I can't do anything and I'm going home? And the people present were like, wow, you didn't even talk to him. But in the post-mortem scenario, it's like, I want to do all of these things. I want to exhume the body. I want to move the plant. I want to do a watercolor of this. I'm going to describe it like it was like Hamlet. And I also want to make a medallion and all this sort of effort. It's really bizarre. It really is bizarre. So Dr. Gachet's son produced this kind of medallion, bronze medallion, which depicts the head of the artist. And so that is what he produced. So that medallion over there, right? And yeah, I think I'm going to take you guys to just 2 more pages, and then there are still 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 pages to go. So although I'm going to stop short of going through the whole chapter in this live stream, there's still 8 pages to deal with, and that gives you an idea just how much there is to talk about Dr. Gachet and his son related to Van Gogh. I mean, this book is titled Van Gogh's Finale, and about the longest chapter in the entire book, I'm not exaggerating, the longest chapter in the entire book has got to deal with Dr. Gachet and his son and their little sort of interesting movements regarding this artist that they knew for 2 months. And so it says here that this medallion that was made was never actually installed, it was never actually used. And it seems the reason was because of Joe. So you kind of get this idea that there's this sort of eagerness, there's this sense of almost of Dr. Gachet and his son almost taking over. We want to do this, we want to do that, we want to interfere here, we want to add something there. And Joe's sort of like, it's okay, you can do that, but that I'm not very happy with. And so in terms of the medallion, Joe didn't want that. She said a simple double grave with Vincent's original stone would be appropriate. So she kind of drew the line and she said, you know what, I think that's enough. I don't want the medallion, just a simple gravestone. I'll be happy with that. And now here's another part that I've highlighted, quoting from Martin Bailey's book. He writes, quote, before Dr. Gachet's death, so before the doctor's death, his son made a solemn promise that he would continue to care for the Van Gogh grave. Now, if you think about that, that's also bizarre. It's like, I promise you, Dad, his father's like very old. Dad, I promise you, when you're gone, I'm going to take over. I'm going to care for Van Gogh's grave. Thanks, son. Thanks a lot. Thanks for that. And what do we know about Dr. Gachet? He really cared about his legacy. He was really interested in this idea of legacy, and he ended up becoming very famous through this most famous painting of Van Gogh, the portrait of Dr. Gachet. That's sort of how we know about him. And one could argue that if Van Gogh never painted the portrait of Dr. Gachet, it's debatable, but one could argue that if Van Gogh never painted that portrait, Van Gogh would never become a famous artist at all. The world would simply just not have known about him. Or if they did, he would have been like a somewhat unknown artist. But because of Dr. Gachet, he was sort of elevated through the channels of art historians and art experts and art, the doyens of art, into this incredible artist. And so he becomes more famous and more valuable and more significant, but so does Dr. Gachet. And isn't that what Dr. Gachet wants? In other words, Dr. Gachet's legend and legacy is linked to Van Gogh's legend and legacy. But it's only going to work if Van Gogh committed suicide and the doctor is sort of his guardian angel, then that story is going to work. But if he's got syphilis and the doctor fails as a doctor and other things, then is that legacy going to work? Is it still going to sort of work out? Yvonne Phillips says Gachet Jr. promising to protect the family secrets. Hey Jealousy says Gachet stopped crying then. Yvonne Phillips says shameful. So I don't know where this comes from, but apparently, I mean, it's quite grotesque. He says the hands that had held the skull of Vincent, meaning it's Paul Gachet Jr., saying the hands that held the skull of Vincent, were they not the most appropriate for this responsibility? I don't know. There's something just there about it. And I'm going to guess that the person who wrote these words are Paul Gachet Jr. Let's just have a look. Number 11. Footnote number 11 for chapter 20. Yeah, Paul Gachet Jr. Gachet Jr. kept to his commitment, and in 1953 he gave 100,000 francs to the municipality to pay for the perpetual care of the double grave. Now this is exactly where you say, so why couldn't you have paid for the lease back in 1905 if you're going to pay for another lease 100,000 francs anyway? Do you get what I'm saying? So it's like, we've got to dig up this grave because the lease is up, but but you're just going to another piece of land where there's a lease anyway. So what's the actual reason why you're doing it? Did you get that? The other thing I've highlighted here, there's not too many highlights on page 164, but I wrote I underlined the following. It's where Bailey writes, the Gachets not only cared for the grave, but also served as a repository of memories about Van Gogh. Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And that is where I have a bit of a problem here, is you guys seem terribly, terribly interested and involved, where prior to that you weren't terribly interested or involved. And certainly during the vital, critical, crucial, emergency circumstances of Van Gogh's death, where were you then? Where was this care and consideration when the guy's actually dying? After he's died, suddenly they are the repository of memories. They are, and it's not just memories. It's through the Gachets that you get told. You know where Vincent shot himself? It was out in the wheat fields. Do you know this about him? Do you know that about him? And all sorts of things. And so we're going to deal with this allegation, which comes from the Gachets. I mean, if you ask the question, where did Van Gogh shoot himself? The answer you're going to get from the Gachets. Oh, no, we will tell you. We can be quite clear where it was. We can actually say it was around about 1 kilometer from his house, and it was behind the chateau, and there was like a wall there, and Paul Gachet Jr. helpfully even draws or paints a painting saying this is also where he died. Okay, thanks a lot for that. Meanwhile, we're going to get some other information, which I'm going to share with you in a moment, which is more likely where somebody actually heard a gunshot, and we're going to talk about where that was heard. And the question remains, it's something you guys can look at. Where did the shooting take place? In the wheat fields or in the town of Orvez? What do you think the answer is? Where do you think this witness heard the gunshot? Now you must remember, a gunshot in the countryside you could probably hear for miles because it's just flat terrain. That sound is going to be it's going to just sort of echo uninterrupted. The sound can just travel, right, over wheat fields. Whereas in a town scenario, the sound can't travel nearly as far, would be harder to hear as well, right? So if he was shot in the countryside, you can imagine someone heard it, like, wow, what is that? There's no one here, and I heard this loud bang ring out. What is that, right? And the question is, did someone in the countryside hear a bang ring out on a Sunday night? Late in the afternoon, kind of evening on a Sunday. So no one's working. There's not work going on, and that's when the shot rings out. You would imagine someone in the country, a farmer or whatever, they would hear a shot ring out if a shot did ring out, right? Paddy says, would love to know what Joe thought of the Gachets. I think Joe probably saw them as helpful. Probably they were contributing money and, to certain things like this burial. And she probably saw them as helpful and kind and well-to-do, and kind of almost as partners in what is going on. And I think they actually had quite a lot to do with one another, because she had the letters, and they had a lot of his paintings and other things as well. It's even possible that they had his art supplies, that they had his easel, that they had his paints, that they had his canvases. We know the Gachets took I don't know what it is, 12 of his paintings. anyway, so yeah, on page 164, the Gachets served as a repository of memories about Van Gogh. Well, the good news is the fortunate aspect of this is, in spite of that, Van Gogh's own letters provide the best repository about him, and that's really where you want to go, and that's what I've done. You want to look at his letters and his art for the best source of information about him. What are his paintings saying about his state of mind? What are his letters saying about his state of mind? And you've got to treat that as far more important as a source than what somebody else says. You got to treat what he's saying about loneliness, what he's saying about the circumstances he's in, what he's saying about what he feels about suicide. So even here you've got Bailey saying, he talks about suicide again and again and again, yes, but then he also says, but I don't really believe in it. I don't think it's right. So he may bring it up, but he also says, but I wouldn't do it. And he, unlike all of his siblings, he was the one that actually studied to be a minister. So he would have been quite aware of the moral aspect to that, in terms of beliefs that he either once held or that he still held, and the beliefs of other people in that, of other Protestants. So now we go to page 165. I'm not going to take it further than this. But on this page, I've really highlighted quite a lot. It talks about the fact that Dr. Gachet wrote a book. So this is where it gets quite interesting. You've got these attempts to, you could say, control the narrative or interfere with Van Gogh or whatever. Like, we're going to exhume the grave, we're going to move the grave, we're going to pay for the upkeep of the grave, we're going to put a medallion on it. No, thank you, please don't do that. We're going to write a book about him, which eventually doesn't happen. Joe writes a book, and that does go on to achieve some renown, and I think it was translated and used in Lust for Life and the movie that came from it. But what is quite interesting is that Dr. Gachet did try and write a book. You just kind of get the sense of he suddenly got really, really involved, and so did his son. And then they also illustrated this book with a lot of their own pictures and paintings, and ultimately nothing happened. Probably because anyway. So then on page 165, it says, despite this plan to write this book, it says, all that survives of Dr. Gachet's writing on Van Gogh are a few lines recorded on 17 September 1890. So this is also incredible from a true crime perspective, is that the person who seems to be the suspect actually puts down a version of events, actually puts down his story about this guy, Van Gogh. And so it would have been amazing to get like his story about the day that he died, and his first impression of him, and if they'd argued, what they'd argued about, and whether he mentioned syphilis and what he says about his daughter, and was there ever something going on with his daughter, and when he read Van Gogh's books, did that change his opinion of him, and this, that, and the next thing, and what did he make of the ear that was off, and just you're getting the doctor's assessment of Van Gogh, and it would be incredible to have that. And then what happens? We know that he wrote it, but then it just disappears as well. Why? So it says here, and this is what Bailey writes, all that seems to survive of Dr. Gachet's writings are a few lines recorded on the 17th of September 1890. So this whole manuscript I think he spent decades writing, he spent a long time working on, but then all that is actually found is ultimately a few lines, I guess, on a page written on the 17th of September. And it deals with Van Gogh's eating habits, of all things, I think. And so this is what the doctor writes. This is the only sort of statement we've got from Dr. Gachet written down about Vincent, and it's to do with eating. And he writes, Vincent was sober and even frugal, looking for simplicity in his diet, and he preferred fruit and vegetables and enjoying bread, particularly with olives. He drank wine, some beer, and a lot of coffee. At times he ate quickly, as if to get rid of something slightly unpleasant. Sometimes he spoke a lot, but other times not at all. When not talking, his eye might indicate an inner anger. Van Gogh was pained when he heard nonsensical chatter, withdrawing into silence. And then that is it. That's the end of those lines. Now, what I find really interesting with those lines are a couple of things. Number one, I've made the suggestion that didn't Van Gogh possibly have dinner at the Gachets on the last night of his life, in terms of before he was shot? Because that would explain why he didn't have dinner at the Revue Inn, why the innkeeper, and they sort of perceived him as always being on time, but he was late that night. The fact is, we know that he'd eaten there previously, not only sort of alone, but when I say alone, I mean unaccompanied by his family, but also as part of like a birthday party with Marguerite and Paul, but also like having, I guess, dinner with the doctor and just, having meals there. So why wouldn't he have had dinner on a Sunday night or Sunday afternoon night? Why wouldn't he have had dinner? And you could say, well, because Dr. Gachet was out fishing. Well, was he? If Dr. Gachet was out fishing, maybe he had dinner there anyway, and he was there with Marguerite Gachet. Where was Paul when this happened? Where was Paul was Paul fishing with his father? Or were neither of them fishing? What was actually going on? Did they all have dinner together? And did Vincent van Gogh perhaps drink a bit of wine, say some things he wasn't supposed to, maybe go from this moment of having dinner? Did he then work on the portrait of Marguerite Gachet at the Harmonium? Did it go from there to then, while he was working on the portrait, Dr. Gachet and his son were doing something else, and maybe Vincent's having had a bit to drink said to her, well, you're actually quite pretty. And she said, oh, really? Do you think so? And then Van Gogh maybe did something he wasn't supposed to do. But it emphasizes here that he drank wine and a lot of coffee. Now, bear in mind, the innkeeper said that she didn't see him touch the Adeline Revue said, I didn't see him touch a drop of alcohol. And our impression is that in order to paint 70 paintings, he probably didn't drink and he wasn't going back to his usual habits. So you kind of have the doctor muddying that narrative a bit. It is possible that he drank wine and beer when he was at the doctor, when in a sort of genteel setting with well-to-do folks, because rich people, when they have sort of a big spread, they like to, with good food, have good wine and good, something nice to drink. And even if you're not drinking, you might participate just because it's a nice situation. You might say, well, I don't drink, but and I'll make an exception here. I'm just saying, if it's true that the doctor observed Van Gogh drinking, it's possible that he drank when he was at the Gachet residence. And if that did happen, it's possible that that drinking may have led to excessive drinking on a Sunday night, on the night that he died. And so Van Gogh may have been not out of control, but it may have been bad-mannered, bad-tempered, kind of a nuisance, insulting, uninhibited in some way, that upset the doctor and led to an altercation similar to what happened with Paul Gauguin when he was drunk on that occasion, kind of thing. And we know that Van Gogh was lonely and was troubled, and he did drink a lot, and that was one of the ways that he dealt with it. So I think it's quite interesting that of all the things that survives, we get Van Gogh's eating habits courtesy of Dr. Gachet. And that may mean that one of Dr. Gachet's final memories of Vincent is that final meal, right? It's interesting that Martin Bailey describes this information we have being on the trivial matter of Van Gogh's eating habits, but it may not be that trivial, because the time that this incident happened to him was dinner time on a Sunday. So I don't know if it's that trivial. I also think it's very interesting that he doesn't only talk about the eating habits, he also talks about, in the context of eating, he talks about he would sometimes speak a lot, but sometimes he wouldn't speak at all. And when he wasn't speaking, you could see anger in his eyes. So you would know when he was angry, he would be quiet, he would be silent, and you'd see inner anger actually in his eyes. And one wonders whether that couldn't have happened at a meal, and then the doctor somehow provoked that anger or prodded him in some way. And then that led to a massive argument. It led to a massive full-on, verbal argument. And that can happen between adult men. It does happen between adult men, and sometimes that can end in a messy way. Maybe Van Gogh insulted him. Maybe he insulted Van Gogh. Maybe he said, I actually don't want you to paint my daughter again. She's told me that she's a bit uncomfortable. Can you imagine how Van Gogh would have reacted to that? Can you imagine if he'd said that and Marguerite had said, no, it's not true. I do want you to paint my portrait. And Dr. Gachet had said, I'm deciding what's happening here. I've read your gross books and I know what's going on in your mind. And you know what? It's fine that you paint here, but just stick to these boundaries. And Van Gogh may have said, you know what? I've had enough of this, or whatever. So there are all sorts of possibilities here. I've also written here, I've also underlined here where he says, on this page 165, Bailey says, considering that he was erudite and a friend of numerous writers, so Dr. Gachet is capable of how can I put it, of recording his thoughts. He's also in the company of people who do that. He's aware of the whole thing of, and doctors do that all the time. They write prescriptions, they describe injuries to some extent. They've got to know, they've got to, what's the word? They've got to have a complete sense of someone's condition in order to know how to deal with it, right? So a lot of it is about a narrative. It's about knowing a situation and responding to a situation in a sense, but also being able to reflect on a situation. Think about autopsy reports. You don't do an autopsy without saying what your findings are. I mean, that's the whole point. You do the autopsy to say, this is the cause of death, this is the manner of death, this is where the injury is, this is how serious it is, this is the nature of it, and it's all recorded, it's all noted. That's the point of it. You don't just do an autopsy out of idle curiosity. So he says, it's surprising that he failed to compile a record of his encounter with Van Gogh. Absolutely. That is absolutely true. And so yeah, you've got another surprise. A surprise that he doesn't mention the bullet. As a military doctor, as a doctor, I'm just not going to, I don't think that's relevant. And it's surprising that he fails to record some kind of encounter with Van Gogh, whether it's the day that he dies, whether it's when Van Gogh painted him, or anything else. And so it is strange, it is mysterious that the only thing that survives of Dr. Gachet's recordings, because we know he did record, is the seemingly trivial matter of what he ate and drank and what sort of personality he had. Something that is quite interesting here, he also says, is Van Gogh didn't really like small talk. He was kind of bored by what he described as nonsensical chatter. And you kind of do get that sense that Van Gogh was quite a serious guy from his letters, that he's not going to talk about the weather. I mean, he might talk about it in terms of the weather's good, I'm going to go out and paint, but not like in an emptier sense. He's not going to talk about, he was a educated, well-read guy and quite a sophisticated thinker. And he wasn't really interested in empty heads and empty hearts kind of thing. So that is also surprising that ultimately from Dr. Gachet, we don't actually have a record. So think about it. We've got a record from Adeline Revue. Even her father told the story over and over and over again. So we've got a record of that fateful day from Adeline Revue, and we don't even have it from the doctor. It's bizarre. They go on to, I think his son wrote a book, but you don't actually have a record of this from the person who's at the center of it. The police even came there to ask what happened. So I've also highlighted the following. This is going through the bottom part of page 165 of this chapter titled Father and Son. Martin Bailey writes, quote, "Today Dr. Gachet is best known as an art collector, and he was also an art collector of Van Gogh's art, which, as we have said quite a few times, the most famous and expensive Van Gogh artwork happens to be the painting he did of Dr. Gachet. Coincidence? Chance? Or was that by design? And what kind of design was that? And how much, right? And then it says, it is often assumed that he owned just the 8 Van Gogh paintings, right? So this is also really interesting. So Bailey's saying, just sort of generally, a lot of people just assume that Dr. Gachet took 8 paintings. Then he says the following, which I've also highlighted. He says, let me just read the whole thing. It is often assumed that he, Dr. Gachet, owned just the 8 Van Gogh paintings that now hang in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. Now, bear in mind, all of these 8 paintings that Dr. Gachet owned found their way into a museum, but you must bear in mind, he didn't just give them to the museum, they are bequeathed, and that typically involves the French government or the art department or whatever you want to call it, the the government department responsible for that aspect, art and culture, whatever it is. They will tend to buy this sort of thing. They will say, this is part of the history of France. This is part of our culture. This is part of the fabric of art history in our country. Oh, do you have that painting? Okay, well, we're going to buy that from you. It's really important. And so all 8 of these paintings that the Gachets owned ultimately come into the possession of the Musée d'Orsay, which is an art museum in Paris. But what Bailey writes is that people have assumed that Dr. Gachet, well, he was an art collector anyway. He collected that artist's art and that artist's art, and he painted his own paintings, and he also copied other paintings. But guess what? He didn't actually own only 8 Van Goghs, right? Here's the part to pay attention to. But in fact, he possessed well over 3 times that number. He originally had 26 Van Gogh paintings, 14 drawings, 3 prints, and a letter with a drawing. That's pretty phenomenal. So Dr. Gachet, turns out, owns 26 Van Gogh paintings. How the heck did you get hold of all of those paintings? Don't tell me you took 26 of his paintings from his funeral. How the heck did you get hold of 26 of his paintings? I mean, he only painted 70 paintings in Orvez. 26 is getting close to half of that number. And you must remember, he didn't paint a painting of Orvez, put it in the garage, paint another one. Some of those paintings went to Theo. Some of those paintings were given to Adeline Revue. Some of those paintings were given to other people. So how the heck did you get hold of 26 Van Gogh paintings? So you might say, okay, well, so people thought he had 8. Okay, so how did he get the other 18? How do you account for him getting the other 18 paintings? So let's just look at some of your comments. Yvonne Phillips says, which book of letters do you like best? To be honest, I've got a book of letters that I actually haven't even really read yet. But to be honest, I prefer going through the letters online. They're 2 resources, and they're free, and you can read them chronologically. You get the translation. So I find that, and that's how I did my research. I find that quite incredible. Just going through the letters. I mean, even if you're not writing a book, just out of curiosity, it's just interesting seeing during this phase of his life, he was doing that, and that's what he thought, and that's what he felt, and that's what he said, and how he matures and how he changes. And so we might do a bonus series where we deal with certain letters, for example, when he lived in London, or certain letters when he was starting out as an artist, or certain letters when he was living in the Borinage, and he was going down into the coal mines, or certain letters when he first moved to Paris and he was living with his brother, or certain letters when he moved to Arles, because we've kind of dealt with the Orvez period, but there are 3 or 4 or 5 other periods where he wrote lots of letters, where you could also get a really interesting narrative sense of what he's doing, because he writes almost every single day. Today I did this, I saw that, I met that guy. I'm quite interested in the news from England about this and that and whatever. So it definitely is quite interesting. So that may be something to do to continue the members-only coverage kind of in future. Or you guys can do it on your own if you want to. But anyway, the fact is, Dr. Gachet's got 26 Van Gogh paintings, 14 drawings, 3 prints, and a letter with a drawing. And so Bailey himself writes, he says, he doesn't say how the heck, but he says, so how did Dr. Gachet amass this treasure trove? Bear in mind, this is actually worth tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. If you had to take those 26 Van Gogh paintings right now and say, how much are they worth? They would be worth hundreds of millions of dollars, literally. Hundreds of millions of dollars. At the time when he had them, they probably wouldn't have been worth that much, but they would have been worth more and more as the legend of Van Gogh became cemented in the public imagination. And guess who was partly responsible for that? And as we all know, an artist becomes more famous and more valuable after they've died. They don't tend to become famous during their lifetimes, and a lot of artists were aware of that. a lot of art historians are aware of that. So it's like the moment the artist dies, boink, now his art's worth 10% more, 20% more, double, whatever. So it goes on to say, so this is where if you say, I think you I think you're out of line with suspecting Dr. Gachet. I think you are wrong. Well, here you have it from this art expert in this chapter saying the following. So, how did Dr. Gachet amass this treasure trove? The sheer number has understandably led to suspicions of underhand acquisitions, sparked off by an interview with Adeline Revue, the innkeeper's daughter. So, here you already have Adeline Revue basically through her influence. Basically, there's like, wow, what she's saying, what he's saying, they don't correspond. What she knows and what he apparently knows is there's a suspicious mismatch here. The stories don't match what's going on, right? In other words, it's a logical inference to draw. And so it says here, in 1955, she claimed that immediately after the funeral, the doctor had ordered his son to gather up the paintings that had been displayed around the coffin in the auberge. Roll them, Coco, he said. And he instructed his son, calling him by his childhood name. So it's quite interesting here that already at this point, you have this sense of the doctor and his son being kind of like, whether you want to say in cahoots or working together, but nevertheless, you have the doctor and his son that are, whether you want to say partners in crime or just partners, that continues up until the time Dr. Gachet dies. His son goes on to do quite a lot. His son, I think, writes a book. His son provides all these answers at the time that Van Gogh kind of becomes famous. In the same way that Joe becomes a major enabler of the Van Gogh legacy, Dr. Gachet's son also becomes a major enabler of the Gachet legacy and the Van Gogh mythology, if that makes sense. So Adeline sees this. Adeline witnesses the doctor acting like a, what's the word? Not a hooligan, but behaving badly, basically like, getting his son to quickly gather all of Van Gogh's, or as many of Van Gogh's paintings as he can at his funeral. So you do get the sense of, wow, geez, don't you have any respect? The guy has just died, and here you are, sweeping in. Shouldn't you be giving these paintings to Theo? Shouldn't you be giving these paintings to his friends that knew him longer than the doctor knew him, like Bernard, or even Gauguin? So anyway, it says, Bailey says, this story is unlikely. He says, I don't think this is true. It rings true because how on earth did Adeline Revue know the pet name that Dr. Gachet called his son, which is Coco? Anyway, so it says here, so what it seems to be happening is Bailey seems to be defending Gachet and also justifying him, kind of saying, nothing was suspicious about this. The fact that he's got 26 paintings, not really a big deal. So the last thing I want to quote here is from page 165. He says, quote, Vincent is known to have given at least 3 paintings to the doctor. Dr. Gachet's garden, Marguerite Gachet in the garden, and the second version of his portrait. And then he writes, Theo almost certainly gave him several more. That is likely true. It is likely true that Theo gave the doctor some paintings as a sort of payment to say, you treated my brother, and so you can take those paintings as payment for treatment. To be honest, I wouldn't give him a single painting based on his unsuccessful treatment. But anyway, of course, so I've actually got a question mark next to that, and the question mark really refers to where Bailey writes, Van Gogh also gave him the second portrait of Dr. Gachet. Really, I don't believe that he did. I don't believe that Vincent painted a second portrait and gave it to him. And I've told you why, because he doesn't mention it. This would have been a big moment, painting the portrait and the doctor asking him for it and asking him for changes. And Van Gogh, being the descriptive, expressive guy that he was, would have said, you know what, Dr. Gachet didn't like me painting those books in the picture, and he didn't like me. He wanted his hand on the flowers, and he didn't like this and didn't like that. He would have mentioned that. It's possible that he did mention it directly to his brother verbally, but it's really unlikely that it wouldn't have come up in a letter somewhere, because it ultimately would have been almost his biggest achievement with one of the most prominent citizens he'd ever met. So you're telling me you'd fail to mention it. So I don't think that he did give a second portrait to Dr. Gachet. We know that he gave the original to Theo. And so you have the portrait of Dr. Gachet becoming the most famous painting, and then there's like a copy of it. So it's like the portrait of Dr. Gachet becomes the most famous, and then there's like a copy of it. Well, can this also become the most expensive painting? And then they both sort of disappear, or certainly one of them disappears under mysterious circumstances. ... Anyway, we then go on to page 166 and 167, but I'm not going to deal with that in this episode. It's already almost 2 hours long. So we'll get to the last eight pages of this chapter in the 15th episode, which will probably be the final episode in the series before we deal with sort of bonus episodes and bonus content. So now I want to come back to this question, which is, where did the Van Gogh shooting take place, right? And so what do you think the answer is? So let's just get a quick thing from you guys. Do you think that the shooting took place near Dr. Gachet's home or far from it? What do you guys think? What do you think is the answer? Yvonne Phillips says Adeline knew Gachet stole the paintings. Yvonne says near the Gachets. Okay, so I don't know. Let me just ask Yvonne. Yvonne, did you watch this YouTube video? I'm going to put a link to it in the chat. And this video, the link that I've just put there, comes from a interview from 60 Minutes. The title is "How Did Van Gogh Really Die?" It was not actually sure when this went up onto 60 Minutes. I'm not really sure when this went up, but Paddy says near the Gachet. So anyway, if you watch that particular video, there's a scene where the author, I think it's Stephen Naife, it's either Naife or Smith, they wrote a book where they felt that it wasn't suicide, right? And they went to Orvez, just like I went to Orvez, and they spoke to people, just like I spoke to people. their research was pretty comprehensive, and they found someone who said that that they heard a gunshot in the town on the night that Van Gogh was shot, right? And so this was recorded. It was something that was told. It was something that somebody witnessed, something that someone experienced, and then told their, I guess, their son. And then, so in other words, this story was repeated through that family's, what do you call it, through the generations of that family. So if it was the grandfather that heard it, it was told to a successive generation, and that's how it comes to us, is that my grandfather told me that he heard a gunshot, and the street where this is identified. So this is a map of Orvez, right? And I'm going to show you another map in a moment, but over here is Dr. Gachet's house, and over here is where Vincent van Gogh lived, and this is Dr. Gachet's house, right? You can see they're not that far apart. Here's the river, right? Now, where do you think this place is where this gunshot was heard? You think it was heard sort of behind the castle over here, which is where the Gachet said? Or do you think it was heard on this side of town, in other words, away from the Gachet side of town? Or do you think it was heard, here's Dr. Gachet's house, here's where Van Gogh lived, here's where Van Gogh lived? Or do you think it was heard somewhere here? What do you think the answer is? So Yvonne Phillips says, yes, I saw it, but I don't recall, sorry. So if you do watch it, I did put it on Patreon. If you do watch it, there's a moment where one of the authors is questioned about this, and he talks about this exact thing. And he basically says that someone's grandparent, he's more specific about it, and you see him sort of going through some documentation, that somebody did hear a gunshot, and where they heard it was a street called Rue Boucher, right? Rue Boucher. And guess how far, so let me cut to the chase. Rue Boucher isn't far from Dr. Gachet's house. Rue Boucher is nowhere near wheat fields. It's in the town fabric of Orvez. Rue Boucher is between Dr. Gachet's house and where Vincent van Gogh was staying. It's not like it was on the other side or the other side. It's between the two. And as far as I remember from the interview, somebody actually said that they saw Van Gogh that night as well. So they heard a gunshot, but they also saw Van Gogh as well. And I think they saw him in this Rue Boucher, right? They saw him before the gunshot. And when they saw him before the gunshot, he was around about 400 to 500 meters away from Dr. Gachet's house, right? So who else is he going to see on Sunday night if he's 400 meters away from Dr. Gachet's house? Who else could it be? Now, I suppose you could say, well, it could be someone else, but I suppose you could also say, oh, if he was 4 meters from Dr. Gachet, well, then he was going to Dr. Gachet's. 400 meters is a bit too far. 400 meters is like 1 or 2 minutes walk, right? It's literally right there. The other thing is, it's not like Van Gogh had lived in that town for 10 years or 20 years or 30 years and he had lots of friends. He really only knew Dr. Gachet. and he was 400 meters or 500 meters from his home on the night somebody saw him, and someone heard the gunshot there on the night that he died. So where's the big mystery here? The other thing that this witness apparently heard was they thought the gunshot happened in a farmyard, meaning that inside some domestic setting, so in other words, a house with a yard or a garden, so not in a street, but in a yard setting or a garden setting, someone thought they heard a gunshot, right? Now, At Eternity's Gate, and At Eternity's Gate was based on the research of Knife and Smith, just as in the same way that Lust for Life was based on the book Lust for Life. It was based on that version. The version of the wheat field with crows, suicide in Lust for Life is what you see in the movie Lust for Life. In the same way, if you go and watch the movie At Eternity's Gate, they show Van Gogh in a courtyard or in an enclosed sort of scenario. And what's the other thing? There's sort of buildings nearby, and it seems like it's not a field. He's not in a field. He's in a somewhat domestic situation. And then these two kids come up to him, and there's a tussle, and the next thing after the gun goes off, they throw the gun into the river. In order to throw the gun into the river, they've got to be quite close to the river, and of course, Auvers straddles this river. There is a very weird scene where after that, he's then walking across the wheat fields. Well, this is why the movie is so ridiculous. In order for Van Gogh to be shot near the river and in this particular area and then go to the wheat fields means he's got to really climb up over a ridge, go behind the castle, and kind of take a really long detour to get home. And by doing that, he would really avoid the entire fabric of the town, but it would be very difficult terrain to move over. I'm not going to show you, just so that you guys can see just how close Rue Boucher is to Dr. Gachet's house. This is the area where someone thought they saw Van Gogh. I'm actually not 100% sure. I may have missed something. It was either that they saw Van Gogh on Sunday night or they heard the gunshot, or both. I'm not sure, but basically locates Van Gogh and the gunshot, or the gunshot on the Sunday night. So I'm going to just bring that up to show you. So when I turn the camera around, you're going to see a Google map of Auvers. On the one side, on the far side, you'll see where Van Gogh's home was, and you'll see that Rue Boucher is closer to Dr. Gachet's house than it is to Van Gogh. So this road where somebody saw something was very close to Dr. Gachet. The other thing that's quite interesting is this road is almost halfway between Dr. Gachet's home and the chateau. So this idea that the chateau somehow plays a role in Van Gogh's death isn't irrelevant. I believe that Van Gogh had to walk under the shadow of the castle, and I've walked there myself. You've got to, as you go there from his house to Dr. Gachet's house, you go past the castle, and when you pass the castle, you sort of go up a rise. It's quite a steep hill you go up onto. The other thing that's important to bear in mind is Dr. Gachet's house is the last. It's on a road that is the last road on the ridge. So there are no more houses higher up than that, right? And also this house overlooks the rest of the town. So you could also imagine if there was a sound coming from Dr. Gachet's house, it would carry, because of the shielding of the ridge behind it, it would carry downwards into the town. And the Rue Boucher is just around the corner from there. downhill and just around the corner from there. So anyway, this is the map. So you can see there I've highlighted if you went by bicycle, it would be 3 minutes. 550 meters isn't the exact distance, it's actually less than that, because that is taking it from halfway down the Rue Boucher, right? So it's actually closer to 450 meters or 400 meters, the distance from Dr. Gachet to the Rue Boucher. Interesting, isn't it? And so if you followed this series and if you followed my investigation into it, you know, if I'm kind of making the claim, I'm making the case that I think Dr. Gachet could have murdered Van Gogh, this is further reinforcement, what I said at the beginning, this is further reinforcement to that idea. In other words, this evidence could be, someone could have been mistaken. You could have had a board falling down or another sound that was not related to it. So this doesn't mean it's absolute evidence, but it is certainly compelling. The fact that someone says that they heard something and they heard it that night and where they heard it, and it's wasn't heard on a wheat field. And as I say, you would think that someone would have heard something like a shot on a wheat field, because it would be so easy to hear noise like that in a quiet expanse. That sound would stand out to you. And a farmer in particular would be thinking, is someone hunting on my land? You know what I mean? And instead, the sound is located quite close to Dr. Gachet. And isn't that because that is where it took place? Again, I'm not 100% sure if it was the sound or that they actually saw Van Gogh near the Rue Boucher. It's a little bit of cognitive bias that's muddying my thoughts, and I meant to watch this just before I went live. So you guys should watch it and just clarify that with you. But the Rue Boucher is mentioned, and you can then watch it there. It is from this video, and it's the research done by Knife and Smith. They wrote their own book on it. But as Yvonne says, it is, either way, it is circumstantially significant. Terry Dean says, you're living on the edge with no mods. Well, there are, I think I can trust all my members. I know my members and I can trust them. So, but Jean Karras is here. She says, I'm secretly watching you. So, so there is a mod in the house. So I hope you guys have found that interesting. I certainly have. I certainly thought that I would get a lot more feedback from Patreon, where I put that information. But maybe some of you are having a busy week. I actually put two maps there, one the walking map and one the cycling map, but you can clearly see how close this the sighting was to Dr. Gachet's house. I think the reason I'm a little bit confused is because someone said that they saw him in that area, and then someone said they looked for something in the farmyards around it and they couldn't find anything. Well, I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't find anything, because if something was covered up, if the gun was removed, if painting supplies were removed, well, then it would have been covered up. Then there would have been nothing to find. Paddy says, absolutely fascinating. Thank you. Pleasure for that. Terry says, I think that too. I was joking. Yvonne says, I'll watch again. Okay. Yeah, so do watch that that link. I can also provide you with another link to two maps that I put on Twitter that just show the location in quite a quite a nice way. You might get a clearer version of it than when I turn the screen around. But the point is there is quite a lot to reinforce this theory of Dr. Gachet's involvement. Even if you say Dr. Gachet didn't murder Van Gogh, he was very, 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 very involved in his life, and that alone seems odd. And even if you take that away, even if you take his involvement in the exhumation, in his possible involvement in the autopsy, that it was possibly Dr. Gachet's gun that actually killed Van Gogh, even if you take all of that stuff away and you set that aside, you've still got the problem of there seem to be fakes that Van Gogh fakes that Dr. Gachet seems to be responsible for. And it's not idle rumors, it's not idle gossip. You also have Dr. Gachet, who literally did want to become a famous artist, who we do know was copying other artists' work. We know that for a fact. And you even had his son copying, apparently, this picture that Van Gogh did of Marguerite by the harmonium. So you even have his son doing the same thing, copying pictures that Van Gogh apparently did and saying, well, this is what he did. We've lost the original, but here it is. And that whole story. Wasn't that possibly the last painting Van Gogh did, the painting of Marguerite Gachet? But the Gachets don't want you to know that, because that would possibly implicate them, right? So yeah, we've still got 8 pages to go through, and I think Martin Beatty does go through some of those issues and some of those problems, and so we'll definitely deal with that in the next installment. I find it pretty strange that this sort of information isn't like breaking news. I'm talking about this thing where, because it's an enduring mystery with Van Gogh, is where did it actually take place? And so you've got these researchers who seem to have found someone who certainly narrows down that location, and yet there's this sort of sense of no, this persistence of the mythology that no, he went out to the field to commit suicide. If he didn't go out into a field, then something else happened, and it's very unlikely that he would commit suicide in town. He would want privacy. And so if people saw him in town and people heard a gunshot in town, then he wasn't looking for privacy. Maybe he was looking for company. Maybe he was alone. Maybe he was looking for company on a Sunday night. Does that make sense? Does that seem more likely? And that is my story. So the sun seems to be coming up. According to my watch, it's coming up in about 19 minutes. I can see clouds in the sky. We are due to have very, very heavy rain. I got a message that there's what's known as a cutoff low. And so when you have a cutoff low, it can't go anywhere. And so all the moisture in that system has to fall as precipitation in order for that system to be, for kind of meteorological equilibrium to take place. Sounds like a bit of a mouthful, but for that sort of stasis to reach equilibrium, all of the moisture in that cutoff low has got to be sort of exhausted out of it. And there's apparently a huge cutoff low over South Africa right now, and they're just warning of huge amounts of rain all over the place, including where I am. They predicted rain now here, but it's not raining at all. So I know it's raining in certain other places. It is scheduled to rain very hard here on Sunday, so we'll see if it does. I can really imagine that being the very last autumn rain. We tend to have dry winters here. The very last major rain we'll have, and then it'll be no rain at all for months after that. So we'll see. Jean says, this is also enlightening. I'm absolutely on board with you believing the eye and ear witnesses. Thanks a lot for that. So the other thing that I think is important is I'm not the only one. I'm not like this lone wolf or lone voice in the wilderness saying, I think it's Dr. Gachet, I think it's Dr. Gachet, or I think something else happened here. There are quite a few others who, some of my research is based on some of their research. Some of my suspicions and doubts is based on something else that I've seen. But I would say my position is somewhat original. I think there are others who in the past have suspected Dr. Gachet. There are also a lot of other suspects like René Secretan and Paul Gauguin, and there are other suspects. Paul Gachet Jr. is also a suspect. But people haven't really fleshed those theories out, and I have. So does it stand up to scrutiny? I think it does. I think if you look at the behavior in the various versions, you can come up with a really compelling story that's got a lot to support it. And as I talk about in true crime, it's not just the premeditation. In this case, I don't think there was necessarily premeditation. There may have been circumstances like reading books and your encounter with a person and your knowledge that he's got this disease and the way that he's looking at your daughter. You may have that, but not so much premeditation as how the post-meditation links up with the actual incident. Why are you suddenly so involved in this guy's life? Why are you so interested in his grave and digging up his grave, and aren't you a little bit worried about the bullet and what might be discovered when this guy becomes famous? And if you do want him to become famous, what else do you need to do? And this, that, and the next thing. So it certainly creates this intrigue, and it is an intriguing story because ultimately it does become incredibly famous. And is that by accident or by design? That's another part that's really interesting. And which painting becomes the most famous ultimately? What is the portrait of Dr. Gachet? Coincidence? Yvonne says, it is original because you have compiled the details in a logical order based on known facts. I have tried to anchor it in evidence, in information that is to some extent verified, to some extent, Adeline Revue's statement definitely is very, very interesting, very, very compelling. Yvonne says, rest your throat and ribs. I am going to do that. This is a fairly short live compared to some of the others, but still quite long. But yeah, I'm going to wrap up now at about 2 hours, 15 minutes. So going back to the poll, most 2/3 of you have voted that you think the shooting took place in the wheat fields. This evidence, this information seems to contradict that it didn't take place in the wheat fields, it took place in the town of Orvez. And so you can speculate and you can ask the question, you can say, we don't know what the answer is, but if it's true, if this information is true, if this witness is accurate, and the shooting did take place in the town, does that change anything? In other words, do you think that could change the circumstances as the world has understood them until this point? Do you think that could change the scenario of what has been believed? Do you think that changes it? And I think it does. I think if he didn't go into the wheat fields, was he not socializing? Was he not having dinner? If he had his painting supplies with him and he was in town, could he have been painting someone's portrait? Or did he go from the wheat fields to town to have dinner with, or did he just stop over just to say hi on his way home? And they invited him for dinner. What is really the situation? Could have been a lot of different things. But if he was shot in town, and the Gachet insist that no, he was shot behind the castle and he was shot on the wheat fields, and the Gachets are so sure that somebody else says no, it was in town. That certainly creates a very interesting dichotomy, doesn't it? So I certainly found that interesting. Terry says the suicide theory lends itself to the drama folks crave. That's absolutely true. There are so many instances in true crime where the more dramatic version and the more drama version is the version people prefer. And it's not true, but no, I believe that because I prefer that. In an interesting way, the drama around Nicole Kessinger is illustrative of that. Is I prefer this dramatic thing where she plays the significant role and so on and so on and so on. I crave that drama, and so I'm going to believe that drama, whatever the facts say, whatever the authorities say, Okay, so I'm not going to take it further than that. In the town of Orvez is up to 37%. I would have loved to have seen it get up to 50% at least, but still not too bad. Thank you to the 42 of you are who are watching right now. It's a nice classroom for a professor, so thanks for that. Thanks also to the members who managed to make it at such short notice. Apologies to those of you who missed the notice. I know this was something like 20, 25 minutes notice for this episode. Sorry to those of you who missed it. But there's still one more episode to go. I'll try and give you guys advance notice for that. And then also thanks for the super chats. Okay, guys, it's Saturday where I am. I think it's sort of late Friday night wherever you are. Have a great weekend, whatever you do. And remember, it's Easter weekend next weekend. But I hope you have a good weekend. Stay safe and take care of yourselves. And I'll see you guys next time. Thanks a lot for that, Paddy. Thanks a lot. Okay, all the best. See you guys next time.